Everyone, my name is Chinmay. I'm the grant specialist, and today we'll be looking at the NHMRC and MRFF direct research cost principles. So I'll be explaining the guidelines for the direct research cost. So what are direct research cost principles? So those principles are being released by NHMRC to guide researchers or applicants to ensure they understand what can be claimed in their application as a direct research cost and what can't be. Again, the individual grant guidelines that you're applying for will take over this DRC principles, but if you have any questions, if you have a successful grant and if you have any questions, right, regarding these principles, you might want to contact your research office as well. So come on, let's get into the DRC principles in more detail. In today's video, we'll look at what the principles are, how these principles specifically apply to salaries and salary on costs. So we'll be looking at in the salary and salary on costs, we'll be looking at salary support packages, personal support packages, the differences between the two. If there's an excess salary, how it can be directed, how it can't be directed. Also, we'll be looking at some funding for postgraduate students, which is postgraduate scholarships, and what sort of funding do they get for the scholarship purposes and what that can be used for. Also, there are the DRC principles also apply to the other research costs. So there are multiple sections under these other research costs that we'll be looking at in our video today. All right, so what are the principles? So the costs that you are actually claiming in your application must be integral to achieving the objectives of your research activity. So if you're submitting an application or proposing a project, the cost that you ask NHMRC for that project has to be integral towards achieving the objectives and outcomes of it, right? Also, it must be directly related to the grant proposal. I mean, the project that you set out in the grant proposal and the research activity that you have set out there. So, I mean, there should not be a mismatch in what you're claiming, the costs you're claiming versus what you're mentioning in the grant proposal. So both have to go hand in hand. Let's say, for example, you're talking about a clinical trial where you're going to recruit 100 participants. So you need to, in your direct research costs, in the other research costs, you should have recruitment costs for 100 participants. That's how it goes hand in hand, right? The costs, the direct research costs, or the amount of money that you ask in the other research cost section must not be for a facility, administrative, or other indirect costs that are provided by the institution. Right, so it has to be directly towards the research, and other indirect costs or administrative costs are not allowed to be claimed in the other research costs or against these DRC principles. So you can't spend NHMRC's money on facilities, administrative costs, or other indirect costs. Also, the grant funds or the NHMRC funds that are being granted to you for your research must not be used to offset an employment-related on-cost. Let's say there are on-costs to your employment when you get a job here. So those costs are supposed to be covered by the institution as per the enterprise bargaining agreement that your organization or the institution will have with the NTEU. So that those costs or those on costs for employing somebody on your research should not be claimed from NHMRC. Those are institutions' responsibility to cover. All right, so let's look at some salaries and salaries on costs. What are salary support packages? So for NHMRC fellowships, NHMRC investigator grants, and NHMRC postgraduate scholarships, these successful applicants are awarded a salary support package. It's not a PSP, it's a salary support package, right? For NHMRC investigator grants, you also get a research support package that cannot be used to offset the on costs of the CIA. So let's say, for example, now for NHMRC investigator grants, the salary support packages that you get are based on the level you apply for. And you get a specific RSP for that particular level that you get awarded for. So let's say, for example, you have a pool of money as RSP, and that's dedicated towards completing the research activity. You do not supplement the SSP, like the salary gaps, due to your actual salary at your organization versus what NHMRC is giving you through that RSP, right? However, recently NHMRC has released a bit of flexibility for NHMRC investigator grants. So for example, for people from 1st of Jan 2026, for people who are having career disruptions, they can actually divert their salary support package towards RSP so that the work continues, or extend the grant by 2 years, at the maximum of 2 years. Again, that is pro rata. So let's say you don't get a blanket 2-year extension to your investigator grant, but it's pro rata. Let's say, for example, if your career disruption is about 6 months, then you can extend the grant by 6 months. However, be very careful if you do extend the grant by 6 months based on the recent NHMRC's flexibility, it might affect your eligibility to apply for other grants. So if that's the case, I would strongly recommend you contact your local research office and get more advice on that, right? In the event the researcher gets a salary from another source, or they win a fellowship, let's say from Heart Foundation, right? Or in that case, you can't have more than one FTE of salary, right? So it has to be, you reduce the SSP, or relinquish it in accordance with the requirements of the grant opportunity guidelines. So I mean, if you get another SSP, then you have to relinquish this one or reduce it, so the total salary that you get across both the funders is one FTE, right? Now let's look at personal support package, right? Personal support package applies to all other grants except NHMRC investigator grant, NHMRC fellowships, and NHMRC postgraduate scholarships, right? So that's also for salary, but in the fellowships and investigator grant, they're called SSP, but for all others, it's called RSP, it's called ESP, right? So salary costs, these PSPs are essentially used, or this is a guide by which we can claim salary costs for a particular personnel on the project, right? So the level of PSP, so there are different levels of PSP. So PSP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the NHMRC has clear guidelines on who should get a PSP 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So I would strongly recommend you have a look at those guidelines. In the salary section of your budget, of your application budget, the level of PSP that you apply for, it must align very well with the roles and responsibilities of the required position rather than the expertise of the appointed person. So let's say, for example, if a role requires a very specific biostatistician or someone, so you have to align that PSP, what you're going to pay them based on what the duties of that position are, rather than somebody who will be in that position, right? So also there will be, usually what happens is there's definitely always a gap between the PSP rate that the person gets versus the actual salary at an organization. So these gaps must be covered by the institutions. RSP can't be used to cover those gaps, right? So ORCs, which is other research costs, you can't use those to cover the salary gaps. It has to be based on, it has to be covered by the institution's local area or whatever sort of framework your institution has. So I would strongly recommend you have a look at, or you have a word with your heads of school or the senior authorities in your local area, and get approvals from them, so that if you are successful in a grant application, you can ask them to cover those gaps. In the event where a researcher is supposed to do a PSP and is awarded a salary from an alternative source, the unused PSP may be reallocated to the ORCs. But so if they get a salary from some other source, and so the unused PSP of the research, they can be reallocated to conduct research as an ORC. However, the other way is not true, right? So be very careful on that. One more thing, for PSPs, if you are a CI on an application, it has to be a PSP 4 or a PSP 5. If you are recruiting a PhD student on your grant, which you can, right? It has to be based on the recent NHMRC's guidelines. They should be awarded, or they should be recruited at a PSP 3 at 50%, which is about $50,000 Australian dollars per year. Now, excess salary, right? In general, for any specified personnel on the grant, the total salary cannot be more than one FTE, right? So, for example, should a CI on a grant is getting one FTE of salary from your grant, let's say, and then they win another grant with someone else, and they have claimed the salary there as well. So it can't be one FTE plus one FTE, so they can't be getting two FTEs of salary. So one FTE has to be there. So there are multiple options there, right? So they can relinquish the salary from your grant, take the salary from the second one, or vice versa, or reduce both to 50% so that they are working on both sides on both the projects half and half. So it's up to the CR and CIAs to discuss on that, right? If you need advice on this, specific advice from NHMRC regarding this, you can ask them. However, you must go through your RAO. Please do not email NHMRC directly with these questions. Email your RAO with your questions, and they will be very happy to take your question to NHMRC and get you the answer that you're looking for, right? Funding for postgraduate students. Now, they get a SSP, as we previously discussed. Right, so postgraduate scholarships, NHMRC postgraduate scholarship people get a SSP. However, if you are recruiting a postgraduate student on your grant, which is a PhD student, in that case, what you have to apply for is a PSP3 at 50%. Right, in that case, you do not say that the student is named as being an NHMRC postgraduate scholarship recipient, because then that translates into an SSP, not a PSP, right? In that case, in regards to the taxation and other issues associated with this classification of funding, the postgraduate students' responsibility and the institution's responsibility to work that out in terms of how they're going to manage the taxation bit of it. Because NHMRC, if you have a postgraduate student working on a grant, let's say if a postgraduate student is working at the university, their income is tax-free. The stipend that they get is tax-free. So that taxation, the behind scenes of that taxation is the responsibility of the institution to take care of. All right, let's look at some other research costs. Now, this was about salaries. So the principles relate to salary. We spoke about SSPs, we spoke about PSPs, we spoke about excess salaries. We also spoke about postgraduate people, postgraduate students working on the grant. Now we look at some other research costs. How do these principles apply to these other research costs? The first thing is biospecimen and data collection. So in terms of biospecimens, so the cost associated with accessing the biospecimen and the data collections must be the direct requirement of the research activity. Yes, you can claim that. Any proposal for funding a new biobank or data collection must specify why samples cannot be sourced from an existing source. So what happens is there are biobanks which you might want to access in terms of collecting data or biospecimens, and so you can definitely claim those costs in your award application, because without accessing that data or those biospecimens, your research activity can't be completed, which means they're directly aligned with the research activity. However, if you can't access a currently available biobank or a data collection facility, then you must tell NHMRC why it can't be done and why a new biobank needs to be established. Computers, IT, and equipment and data processing. So normal computers, which are organizations' responsibility to provide you, cannot be purchased from your other research costs, or you cannot be requesting money for that. However, if you need a very specific personal equipment, or you need very specific hardware or software, or data processing analytics services and things like that, yes, you certainly can claim money or ask NHMRC for those funds. Let's say, for example, you're conducting a clinical trial, and there's a trial site that you have, a remote trial site, and you need to buy, let's say, phones. You need to buy tablets for data collection or interviewing people or filling information and things like that. Yes, you certainly can ask money from NHMRC for that, because that is aligned towards completing your research activity. However, in scenarios where, for example, you're conducting a trial, let's say Barwon Health, in Geelong is your, let's say, a trial site, and you're asking for computers to be used at Barwon Health. No, that won't be allowed, because in that case, it's Barwon Health's responsibility to provide those computers to them, right? Conferences. Now, conferences costs are usually not decided, in the when you are submitting an application budget, because it's not able, it's very hard to predict where and how knowledge translation or transfer of work will occur, right? Uh, However, if you decide to go to a conference, funds can certainly be used to support conference attendance for purpose of presenting the research outcomes. Um, So cost incurred by administering institution for the purposes of hosting conferences. So if your administering institution or your institution is hosting a conference, those costs cannot be requested from NHMRC, because that essentially is it has to be covered by your organization and not NHMRC, right? So if you decide to go to a conference down the line, you don't include those costs in the application budget. But if you do choose to go to a conference, yes, your RSVs can be diverted towards conference attendance as well. However, if you're traveling overseas or things like that for a conference, that needs prior approval from your local area of your university or your institution. All right, consumer and community engagement. Certainly, costs related to involving and engaging consumers and community representatives may be considered as DRCs, right? Which includes recruitment, training, remuneration for engagement, language translation support for, if the consumers are not English speaking, or dissemination of communication and research outcomes. If there are some costs related to that, yes, you can actually claim that in your other research cost section. Clinical trials and cohort studies, certainly yes, as we discussed, you can certainly ask NHMRC to support clinical trials and cohort studies. That's the Human Research Ethics Committee application fees, costs associated with data safety management boards, recruitment and of participants, travel reimbursements, of refreshments and other sort of disbursements can be asked. You can spend NHMRC money on that, as they're directly aligned with your research activity. However, what you can't claim as other research costs is insurance policy premiums or other salary on costs or administrative on costs that usually have to be covered by your administering institutions. Entertainment, meals, and hospitality, except incurred. Let's say, for example, we're talking about food and hospitality for your participants and things like that, that align directly with the research activity. Yes, you can certainly cover that. However, otherwise, it's not an ORC. Alcohol cannot be included as an other research cost item unless it is an active sort of product to be used in the research, or your research heavily is on that alcoholic product. Yes, in that case, you can use your other research costs and claim money for some alcohol there. Equipment that is very unique to the completion of the project. Yes, you can ask for that. Ongoing service and maintenance has to be done by the administering institution and cannot be charged as DRCs, where service and maintenance costs are included in component product with an existing item requires on one-off repair, upgraded purchase, additional components to enable it to be usable for specific purposes. So if, for example, when you're buying an equipment, there might be a service, which you can certainly, claim, because that will help the equipment run to do your research. So be very careful about that. Fringe benefits tax is excluded from the ORC, and funds cannot be used to pay for this expense. Land and building fixtures, is the responsibility of administering institutions and must not be paid for with NHMRC funds. Publications and open access costs. NHMRC funds can be used to support specific costs to publications and open access. Other costs that are related to dissemination are the responsibility of your research organizations. However, if there are any other costs, let's say, for example, you're disseminating on a media platform or a video podcast or webcast or whatever, yes, that can be claimed as an ORC. Stationery and photocopying. For stationery and photocopying, yes, if it is specifically related to the completion of your project, yes, you can certainly claim that. However, if it is about the stationery and photocopying of your business as usual thingy, which is ideally the responsibility of administrative institutions, they must be provided by the administering institutions, which is routine usage. If it's very higher than routine usage, yes, which is specifically for your project, yes, you can claim them as ORCs. Postgraduate scholarship allowance. So postgraduate scholarship allowance is given to the postgraduate scholarship applicants, and that can be used for purchase of a computer, lab consumables, fees and charges for your education training, or conference attendance, or publications in the research activity. All right, so here we come to the end of it. So if you have any questions, please feel free to comment down on the video, and do like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And please let me know in the comments if you need anything specific from our end that we need to make a video on. Thank you.